Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Russian army was condemned to solitude in Ukraine. There is no Russian military force left in Ukraine that can counter Zelensky army. Russian soldiers are running away from the fronts in Ukraine without looking back. Russia is paying a heavy price for the invasion it started in Ukraine in February. The Russian army has lost about 80,000 soldiers in Ukraine to date, and thousands of injured Russian soldiers are fighting for their lives in the hospital. Russian soldiers paid the most for this invasion initiated by Russian leader Putin. After heavy losses in the Russian army in Ukraine, Russian leader Putin signed a decision that would affect everyone living in Russia in order to maintain the military power in the army. And he made a declaration of mobilization, which included the recruitment of 300,000 soldiers to join the Russian army in Ukraine. Putin's declaration of mobilization created a bombshell effect on the agenda. After the mobilization decision, the Russian people panicked and started to flee from Russia. Russian men flocked to the borders of countries neighboring Russia to leave their home, work, and family behind. The migration that Russian men started to flee the country caused long queues of pedestrians and vehicles at the border. Putin's lines after the mobilization decision in the Russian people. Hundreds of thousands of Russians took to the streets to protest this decision taken by Putin. Russian demonstrators transformed to the streets of many Russian cities, especially Moscow, into war-torn streets. Russian leader Putin made a statement about the mobilization launched in the past months as if all these developments had never happened. Putin announced that the mobilization announcement aimed at recruiting 300,000 additional soldiers to the Russian army has been completed and has reached its goals. The Russian leader thanked the Russian officials who contributed to the mobilization process. However, although the Russian leader stated that the mobilization was successful, some developments in the Russian army proved the opposite of the situation. While Russia tried to hold the Ukrainian lands that it claimed to belong to itself in the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine, setbacks followed. Setbacks in the Russian army forced the Kremlin to implement a military draft and increasingly rely on mercenaries from the Wagner and Chechen troops. The Russian army relied on mercenaries to fight on the Ukrainian fronts. In addition to the Wagner and Chechen units that provided support to the Russian army, it was claimed that Afghan soldiers would take their place in the ranks of the Russian army. A shadowy private Russian mercenary force with close ties to the Kremlin has expanded its ranks in Ukraine by recruiting US-trained Afghan commandos and other security forces who fled to Iran after the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. A former Afghan general said in a statement. He said he was trying to increase it. About 15 former Afghan commandos joined the Russian Wagner militia, according to the General Abdul Rauf Argandival, a former Afghan Defense Ministry official and commanders of Afghanistan elite 207 Zafar Corps. And thousands more could be recruited to fight in Ukraine with Iranian help, former Afghan officials claim. The Russian Wagner militia group plan is to recruit 1,000 Afghan soldiers in the first phase and 1,000 Afghan soldiers in the second phase, and continue this process gradually. General Abdul Rauf Argandival, commander of Afghanistan's elite 207 Zafar Corps, said by phone, "There is no information about their fate," Argandival said of the commandos who joined Wagner, and there has been no confirmation from Kiev or elsewhere that Afghan soldiers have reached the battlefield in Ukraine. The Russians are continuing attempt to recruit some Afghan commandos who previously moved to Iran and Russia through the Wagner security company. Argandival said he was personally briefed on the enlistment by hundreds on his former soldiers. Applications for mercenaries broke out in the ranks of the Russian army in Ukraine to fight against the Ukrainian army. The Afghan general said that former members of the Afghan National Army, Afghan National Police, and other former security forces lined up to be taken to Russia and then to fight in Ukraine. During the nearly 20-year war in Afghanistan, tens of thousands of Afghan military and security personnel were trained by the US military. Most of the Afghan army, police and military and intelligence officers loyal to ousted government have fled to Iran, Pakistan and other countries. Even before the fall of Kabul, about 3,000 Afghan security forces, from high-ranking officers to infantry, crossed the border to Iran with their military equipments and vehicles. The US Special Inspector for Reconstruction in Afghanistan said in May, many said he returned to Afghanistan after his offer. Shortly after the Taliban returned to power, Iran reportedly offered temporary visas to Afghans who could prove they served in the Afghan army. More than 80,000 at-risk Afghans who worked or fought with the US and other Western powers were killed without trial in Afghanistan, as tens of thousands of ex-military and government employees were marched through Kabul. The scandalous attack in Afghanistan has led to concerns from US military and political leaders that Washington is not doing enough to evacuate Afghanistan fighting against the Taliban. And the prospect that an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 US trained soldiers will have no alternative but to join the Taliban revealed. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan in August made the US the target of criticism arrows. A Republican-led US congressional investigation critical of the US withdrawal identified the risk posed to the US by former Afghan forces defecting to Iran. The risks identified include techniques and procedures as Afghan personnel know the tactics of the US military and intelligence community. In Afghanistan, an officer training Afghan soldiers expressed the risk posed by Afghan fighters as follows. Mike Edwards said that trained Afghanistan soldiers would mean some of the best are working against us. General Abdulrauf Argandival, commander of the Afghanistan 207 Zafar Corps, said Iranian authorities had given an ultimatum to Afghan special forces moving to Iran to either return to Afghanistan or fight for Russia in Ukraine. There is a great demand for Afghan commandos to fight in Ukraine. Russian Wagner Group officials reported that Afghan commandos were required to fight in Ukraine, and former fighters said they were contacted via messaging service. A military source told the magazine that as many as 10,000 former Afghan commandos may be willing to accept the Russian Wagner's offer. A claim was made about the Russian Wagner Group, which offered the Afghan commandos to fight on the Russian front. There are allegations that the Russian Wagner Group is ambushing Afghan special forces with the promise of $1,500 a month and a safe haven for family members. However, many developments continue to refute these claims made for the Russian Wagner Group. He said that a former Afghan commando in Iran was considering joining Wagner and that Wagner said he believed many would. The ex-commando said he felt many of his fellow soldiers had been abandoned by Washington, and that his offer included issuing visas to Russia for him, as well as for his children and wife in Afghanistan. This was not the first attempt by the Russian Wagner Group to recruit fighters. The Russian group has made great efforts among the soldiers in Syria before. The Wagner Group has been involved in Russia's war in Ukraine from the very beginning. And early in the conflict, there were reports suggesting that the mercenary group was offering Syrians $3,000 per month to join the war. Ukrainian intelligence said some 40,000 Syrians were preparing to side with Russian forces in Ukraine. But only a few hundred Syrians are believed to have actually reached the battlefield, and the enlistment effort was eventually widely dismissed as Russian disinformation. However, the last move of the Russian Wagner Group involving Afghan soldiers is in a completely different dimension. Consider it to be highly skilled and trained fighters, the potential impact of Afghan commandos should they fight in Ukraine has been the subject of the debate. A former senior Afghan security official told Foreign Policy that their involved in the Russian-Ukrainian war would be a game changer for the Kremlin's war effort. Although it is stated that the Russian army will become stronger with the inclusion of Afghan commandos, the past failure of Afghan commandos should not be forgotten. With Afghanistan defensive failures evident against the Taliban, Afghan forces are too disorganized to be recruited in large numbers to form an undefined combat force. Afghan fighters are trained but definitely not motivated. How much more times does the Russian army need to realize that it cannot succeed in Ukraine with concentration and mercenary units? Russian leader Putin needs to look for the other ways to get out of the helpless situation in Ukraine. Otherwise, the end of Putin's army in Ukraine seems imminent. Thanks for watching us.